President, I appreciate the chance to rise today to talk about a success story in Virginia in the elections last night, but I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack than my colleagues, and I'm not going to talk about my pride and my friends who won elections. I'm instead going to talk about the turnout in the elections. Virginia has governor's races every 4 years, and we do them in an odd year cycle where the governor's race is the year following the presidential race. And this has been our practice for a very long time. And we can look at the turnout as the state has grown in population. We can look at the total turnout in a governor's race and get some sense for what is happening and how engaged our electorate is. Virginia has had a history in the past of significant obstacles to voting. My father-in-law fought in the submarine corps in the Pacific during World War II. And he came back to the state, and the first governor's race after he got back from World War II was in the late 1940s. And he noticed that the total turnout in that race represented almost single digits in terms of the eligible voter population. Virtually nobody voted. And my father-in-law, Lynn, who later became governor of Virginia, said, wait, I was in the Pacific fighting for democracy, and I come home to my home state, and virtually no one is even voting for governor. That led him to start a career in politics that eventually achieved him the distinction of being the first Republican ever popularly elected to be governor of Virginia in 1969. What was happening in Virginia in those days was poll taxes and literacy tests and other things that restricted people's ability to vote. And we've had a remarkable transformation under both Democratic and Republican leaders that has expanded the franchise and expanded participation. And what I want to stress very clearly is voting turnout, voting participation, making it easier to participate is not a partisan thing. It helps Republicans and it helps Democrats. And you can tell that by looking at the history of Virginia gubernatorial elections and seeing what happens when turnout goes up. Sometimes it's great for Democrats, sometimes it's great for Republicans. I'll give you an example, Mr. President. 4 years ago, in 2021, we had a race in Virginia, and Republicans swept all 3 statewide offices. Republicans elected Glenn Youngkin to be our governor, and he has now served the single 4-year term that Virginia grants to governors. We're the only state where you can't run for re-election. Virginia elected our first woman lieutenant governor, Republican Winsome Earl Sears, and she was also the first woman of color to hold a statewide office. And Virginia elected 4 years ago Jason Miyares. Mr. President, you and I were chatting about him earlier today, who is a Cuban-American, to be our Attorney General. Okay, why do I bring up that election from 4 years ago? I bring it up because it was notable in that the Republicans swept, but it was notable for another reason. The turnout in that race in 2021 was 25% higher than the turnout 4 years previously. It was the second largest jump in turnout between any governor's races in Virginia. And Mr. President, I'll say with a matter of pride, the first biggest jump was between my father-in-law's 2 governor's races in 1965 and 1969. He ran for governor as a Republican in 1965 and lost. He ran for governor as a Republican in 1969 and won, and the turnout jumped by 68%. Why? Because the Supreme Court struck down poll taxes. And the Voting Rights Act struck down poll taxes in federal elections. And when poll taxes went away, a huge surge of additional participation. So when Governor Youngkin and Winsome Earl Sears won and Jason Miyares won in 2021, why were they able to get a 25% increase in voting participation in Virginia? They did it because Virginia made reforms to guarantee and expand the right to vote. We embraced mail-in voting. We embraced no-excuse absentee voting. We allowed people to vote for 45 days before the election day. And by doing those 3 things, some of which President Trump says should be banned at the national level, it helped a Republican ticket sweep all races in Virginia. We went, by most estimates, from being one of the states that made it harder to vote. We traditionally were ranked in the 51 states plus D.C., we were usually ranked about 45th in the ease of access to the ballot. We went from the bottom to the top 10, and it was good for a Republican ticket. Governor Youngkin, Lieutenant Governor Sears, Attorney General Miyares won a big election with increased turnout. Expanding access to the ballot is not a partisan thing. Last night, Democrats had a sweep. My friend Abigail Spanberger, who served in the House with a number of my Senate colleagues, was elected to be Virginia's first woman governor. My friend Ghazala Hashmi, a state senator, actually my state senator, she's the one I write cranky letters to when I have to write a cranky letter to an official. She was elected to be Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, and get this, this is pretty amazing. She is the first Muslim American woman ever elected to a statewide office anywhere in the United States. And my friend Jay Jones, who I've known since he was 11 years old, was elected to be Virginia's first African-American Attorney General. They also saw a big increase in turnout. The turnout that we had last night was about 10% higher than the turnout that we saw in 2021. So the point that I just wanted to make by standing here is my colleagues have talked about the variety of threats there may be to ballot access, whether it's forced redistrictings or whether it's President Trump saying, you know, we should abandon vote by mail or make it harder for people to vote. The history of my state shows if you make it convenient for people to vote, number one, more people will vote. And number two, that can be good for Republicans or Democrats, depending upon the political dynamic of the time and the strength of the candidates in their campaigns. It used to be that voting and voting rights in this chamber was pretty bipartisan. When the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 nationally, it wouldn't have passed without Republican votes. Yes, it was a Democratic president, LBJ, who put it on the table, but it was Republican senators disproportionately who carried the torch to victory on the Voting Rights Bill in 1965, as many Southern Democrats opposed that bill. As the Voting Rights Bill has been reauthorized over time, it was always reauthorized significantly with both Democratic and Republican votes. It's only been in the aftermath of the Shelby decision, which happened right as I came into the Senate, that voting rights has started to seem like a partisan issue, where Democrats have tried to restore some of the voting rights provisions, for example, the pre-clearance provisions in Section 5, but have struggled to find any Republican willing to do it. So the point that I want to make as I conclude is just that I'm happy in Virginia because my friends won last night. But I'm happy anytime we have elections where people really participate. And where I get really depressed about elections is when turnout is low. Last night we had big participation. That benefited Democrats. 4 years ago we had big participation. That benefited Republicans. The kinds of things we've done in Virginia to make elections more accessible to all are common sense and convenient rules that I embrace at the national level and that are good for democracy, sometimes benefiting one party, sometimes benefiting another, but ultimately good for democracy and good for voters. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsop-Brooks.